Alright, everybody, this is section 2 of your JFK and Lyndon Johnson notes. So we're going to talk a little bit about Kennedy's domestic policy, and then we'll talk about the Great Society just a little bit, just kind of introducing that as Johnson has to take over for Kennedy. And then we will briefly talk about the space race. We'll cover that more next week, and then we will talk about JFK's assassination. Alright, as Kennedy showed in his 1960 campaign and his inaugural address, he had a special quality or charisma that set him apart, especially from Nixon, but from a lot of different politicians. He was not like a politician a lot of people had seen before. A lot of people attributed that to his age, but behind the scenes, Kennedy did actually have a lot of health problems. He had colitis, prostasis, osteoporosis in his back. He had Addison's disease, which is an illness that affects his ability, his body's ability to regulate blood sugar and sodium. So behind the scenes, he was in a lot of pain. And had to be on a lot of different medications for most of his presidency, but he kept all of that very hidden for the public. Kennedy surrounded himself with other distinguished men. Some people called this his brain trust, or the best and the brightest. As I mentioned in our first section of notes, Robert McNamara, who was probably the most disliked, most misunderstood guy in that group, just because he did come across as kind of a know-it-all. He served as Kennedy's Secretary of Defense, and he would serve as Secretary of Defense for a while. Dean Rusk had been president of the Rockefeller Foundation, and he was President Kennedy's Secretary of State. JFK promised Americans that his new administration would blaze a new frontier. This was kind of in reference to a couple of different things economically, improving our education, a lot more emphasis on math and science and STEM classes, healthcare, and improving civil rights. But it was also a hint towards Kennedy's intentions to jumpstart our space program and get it up to par and hopefully get it ahead of the Russian program. While early in his presidency, Kennedy's focus was mainly on foreign affairs with the events in Cuba, which we talked about yesterday, or in section 1 of your notes, rather, and in Berlin. In 1963, he had time to focus more on his domestic agenda. Now, had Kennedy not been killed the same year, it would have been really interesting to see what he personally would have accomplished in his domestic agenda, moving into the last few years of his first term, and this is just the assumption that he would probably have been elected to a second term, but that looked likely. While Congress shot down most of his more ambitious programs, Kennedy was able to push through an increase of minimum wage, extending Social Security benefits, and improving the welfare system. He also established the President's Commission on the Status of Women, which we've talked about before, which looked into how poverty and discrimination affected women specifically, and this resulted in, or partly resulted in, the passage of the Equal Pay Act in 1963, which required equal wages for equal work. Now, this did not fix the gender pay gap. The gender pay gap still exists, but it did improve it because it said you cannot pay a man and a woman who are doing the exact same job with the exact same experience differently. They have to be paid the same. The reason it didn't fix it is it does not focus or look at the reasons for the gender wage gap, which is females' likelihood of being overlooked for promotions and things like that. Kennedy believed that increased prosperity would help to eliminate a lot of the nation's social programs. He took office with a sluggish economy, but he proposed tax credits to encourage business investments and new factory equipment. He did increase the military spending, and he changed the way that he was spending money in the military, which we talked about in section 1. He differed a lot from Eisenhower in not spending all of his money or all of the military budget on just increasing our nuclear weapons. We still did that, but some of it shifted to creating more investments in conventional troops. He created special forces and the Green Berets, so it was differentiated more than Eisenhower's had been. Kennedy definitely believed in increasing civil rights, but he still pursued a rather timid approach to it. It would have been interesting, again, to see what kind of approach he would have taken past 1963, which is, that's as far as we can really look and see what he did with it. But he narrowly won the 1960 election. We talked yesterday about how he did help get Martin Luther King released from jail. Some people thought that was just a stunt to help get him elected. I would make the argument it was a little bit of both. Knowing you would need bipartisan support to pass anything, he had to tread carefully when it came to civil rights issues, because a lot of southern states and conservative groups, and that would include a lot of the Republican Party, were not as willing to go above and beyond on civil rights issues in the 60s. While Kennedy had to remain politically passive on civil rights, African Americans and white supporters of the civil rights movement obviously challenged segregation, which we covered in a lot of detail in the past few weeks. And you know that he introduced that civil rights bill in 1963, and it did not get passed before his death, which we will talk about in just a minute, but we'll kind of shift gears here just a second and talk about President Johnson taking over. Now, Kennedy was visiting Dallas on the campaign trail. So after he was killed, Johnson had to make the decision, even though he was going to take over as acting president, but he would only take over for a little, about a year, and then he would have to decide if he was going to run in Kennedy's place or not run. He chose to take his place on the ticket at the request of the Democratic Party as well. So he runs, and he does get elected, defeats Barry Goldwater in the 1964 election. And we'll talk a little more about Johnson's domestic policy in the next section, but Goldwater's extreme conservatism did not ring true to Americans at that time. If Goldwater were to bring that message about later, he probably would have stood a better chance. But Johnson won the 1964 election in a landslide, partly because he did look like the next strong leader that we needed. Our president had just been shot. It was completely unexpected. Even people that weren't Kennedy's biggest fans were still in a state of shock after losing someone like that, and so publicly. So he was seen as a solid choice on both sides of the aisle. The launching of, kind of switching into the space race here, the Soviet satellites Sputnik 1 and Sputnik 2 in 1957. Remember, Sputnik 1 was unmanned, and then Sputnik 2 had the dog in it that the Soviets sent up. Called American technology and superiority into the question. So in the 50s, the late 50s, we started shifting our education focus and created NASA to try to get us going in the right direction, space race-wise. In April of 1961, however, the Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin was the first human to ever orbit the Earth. And when this happened, it truly did terrify a lot of Americans, because we didn't realize how far behind we were. And then this happens, and it seems like we are definitely losing by a lot the space race, because if they can put someone in Earth and actually orbit it, it is possible in our minds that it's just the next little flip of a switch and they can put weapons up there. So NASA gets going as quickly as they can. Kennedy recognizes the need for it. In May of 1961, NASA puts the first man, Alan Shepard, into suborbital flight. It is not the same thing as actually orbiting the Earth. We'll get to that later. Encouraged by this, Kennedy committed the United States to landing a man on the moon by the end of the decade. America's quest to reach the moon was punctuated by enormous success and a lot of failures. In 1962, so a year later, John Glenn became the first American to orbit the Earth. Astronauts Virgil Grisham, Edward White, and Robert Chaffee were burned to death when their docked capsule exploded. We'll talk about this, and we'll watch some footage of some of these space race moments a little bit later on. And then July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong becomes the first man to walk on the moon. Alright, so here is just a little timeline of some of the major milestones in the 60s to start with, and then I include some things from the 80s. So like we've got the Challenger explosion in 86. We'll talk about that when we get a little bit further along in this class. Pathfinder landing on Mars in 1997. We'll talk about that a little bit later. During his first 2.5 years in office, Kennedy made the transition from a politician to a national leader. In foreign affairs, he really did an excellent job. No one can really find a blemish on his record foreign policy-wise. You could include the Bay of Pigs disaster, but he kind of gets a pass on that a little bit at least, because the plan for that invasion was not his plan. He kind of inherited that from the Eisenhower administration, and he learned from it. He did not just go by the word of the CIA when it came to making decisions later on. He wanted to make sure in his own right, and that is why the Cuban Missile Crisis ended in a successful way and not in a catastrophic way, because he trusted himself and the actual stuff he could see. In domestic affairs, he came to the conclusion that the federal government had to lead in the struggle for civil rights. Like I said, it would have been interesting to see what stance he would have taken further into the 60s on civil rights issues, but he can't play the what-if game. And then this is not on the slide. It's something we'll talk about more after spring break, but we haven't talked about it yet. Vietnam is happening during all of this, and that's another thing that it is a fun topic for historians, especially, to kind of play the what-if game on. What would Vietnam have looked like if Kennedy had been able to serve, at least one complete term, but, assuming he would have got reelected 2 terms, most historians agree it would have looked a lot differently and probably a lot better. The other interesting thing you can maybe think about is, would Richard Nixon have even been a candidate to be elected in 1968? Yes, Kennedy couldn't have run again, but the assumption is maybe Johnson would have run then, maybe Robert Kennedy would have actually won then and not been assassinated, but we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit. Anyway, on the campaign trail for 1964, Kennedy visited Dallas, Texas, November 22nd, 1963. While his motorcade moved through the city, he was in a convertible. The assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, was on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository building, fired 3 shots. The third one hit the president in the head. The first shot hit him kind of in the back shoulder area. We'll talk about this a little bit more later on. Kennedy was taken to Parkland Memorial Hospital, pronounced dead half an hour later. His body was flown back on Air Force One immediately that day, and Vice President Lyndon Johnson was sworn in on the airplane before they actually took off from Dallas. The Warren Commission confirmed that Oswald acted alone. I know you might be interested in all the conspiracy theories. I don't think any of them are true. I think that they're interesting, but unfortunately, history sometimes is exactly what it looks like, which is the obvious truth. But anyway, Oswald was killed by Dallas nightclub owner Jack Ruby before he could actually be sentenced, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on as well. Alright, last slide is just some pictures here of what we were just talking about, the assassination. So the top left picture is Lee Harvey Oswald posing with the gun he would use to kill President Kennedy. Top middle picture is President Johnson being sworn in on the plane with JFK's now widow, Jackie, next to him. The picture on the far right is from President Kennedy's funeral. So that's his wife there in the middle. His brother is actually to her left, which would be your right, Robert Kennedy. He would run for president in 1968, and he would actually also be assassinated. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And then JFK's children are down by their mother, and you can see the little boy saluting. That is Kennedy's son, John Jr., saluting his dad's casket as it came by. The bottom left picture is a picture of Jack Ruby shooting Lee Harvey Oswald down in a tunnel as they were attempting to move him out of the police station. So that's what that is. Anyway, this is where we're going to stop this section of notes. There's one more section for this chapter of notes that we'll talk about President Johnson's domestic agenda, the Great Society, stuff like that, and we will go over that another time.